The Sovereign Armada dropped out of fold space, in a formation so precise that 3 inhabited moons fell silent just from the gravitational wake. Esirith, who reads patterns, felt it through the hull of the observation vessel before the instruments confirmed it. A pressure change, a wrongness in the local fabric of space, the way a pond's surface shudders when something vast moves beneath it. She pressed her sensory membranes flat against the forward observation glass and watched 4,000 warships arrange themselves in the void above a small blue world with the patience of a species that had never lost. The Kethrin did not rush conquest, they composed it. Each warship took its assigned coordinate and held there, thrusters breathing in microcycles, maintaining the geometric perfection that was not merely tactical but spiritual, the eternal pattern, the shape the universe made when order imposed itself on chaos. Esirith had seen the pattern deployed 17 times. She had watched civilizations look up, understand what they were looking at, and begin transmitting surrender codes before the first ultimatum was even broadcast. She had been assigned to this mission as cultural observer because she was the Empire's foremost analyst of pre-contact behavioral signatures. The king himself had reviewed her appointment. "Tell me why they don't run," he had said, and she had not understood the question until now. The humans were not running. She checked the sensor arrays again, certain she was misreading something. A species at type 0.7 on the Kethrin Civilization Index, barely unified, no fold space capability, no evidence of weapons platforms with range sufficient to threaten even the outermost ships of the Armada, and yet their orbital satellites were repositioning. Not evacuating, repositioning. Esirith watched a cluster of human orbital stations rotate in slow, deliberate arcs, pointing their instrument arrays at the fleet. Every sensor she could read pointed outward, toward the Armada. They were looking back. She opened a secondary feed and began parsing human broadcast signals, electromagnetic, the primitive carrier medium this species had not yet outgrown. The signals were dense, tangled, 1,000 frequencies shouting simultaneously. She had expected panic. She had cataloged 47 species responses to the sight of the eternal pattern, and panic was the universal constant. Even species that chose defiance did so, with the chemical markers of terror running through their biological systems like signal fire. The human signals did not parse as panic. They parsed as, she ran the analysis twice, then a third time, argument. Rapid, high-intensity, multi-party argument on thousands of simultaneous frequencies. She could not yet decode the content, but she knew the structure of a species arguing about what to do next. She had seen it twice before, in civilizations that had managed to mount brief, ineffective resistance before the pattern wore them down. The difference was the tone. Those species had argued with the high-frequency chemical broadcast equivalent of screaming. The humans were arguing at a register that her instruments could only describe as purposeful. Then the diplomatic channel activated. Fleet Commander Veilsoreth's office had broadcast the standard contact frequency 6 hours before the fleet arrived, as protocol demanded. Esirith had expected silence. Most species needed days to organize a response. The humans had needed 6 hours. A voice came through, female by the tonal markers her translation matrix had partially assembled. Calm, almost professionally calm, in the way that only registered as strange once you noticed it. "This is Inari Salak, representing the Unified Earth Diplomatic Corps. We've received your approach vector and your contact frequency. Before we can begin any formal dialogue, we need to establish some baseline information. Which king sent you?" Veilsoreth stared at his communications array for a long moment. Esirith, monitoring from her station 3 decks aft, found herself cataloging the silence. The humans had not said, "We surrender." They had not said, "What do you want?" They had not even said, "Why are you here?" They had asked a question, a specific, information-gathering question about the political structure of the entity threatening to destroy them. Esirith pulled up her specimen notes and began a new entry. She labeled it, Anomalous Response Pattern, Priority Classification. Vale Soreth responded with the standard identification protocol, the name and lineage of King Velsora the Undying, his 17 titles, the Armada's designation, the number of ships. It took 4 minutes to recite. At the end of it, Vale Soreth waited for the appropriate stunned silence that followed the revelation of the Armada's full composition. The human's response came back in 11 seconds. Thank you. We'll need approximately 6 of your standard time units to prepare our formal response. In the meantime, could you confirm the Armada's fuel source? We're seeing some emission signatures we want to classify correctly. Vale Soreth cut the channel and turned to look at Esirith across the bridge. His chromatophores, the Kethrin's primary emotional display system, were cycling through colors she associated with confusion and the particular discomfort of encountering a situation that did not fit available cognitive categories. She understood she was experiencing something similar. She was about to file an initial observation when the second transmission came through. Esirith almost missed it. She had been focused on Vale Soreth's color display, but the communications array flagged it automatically. One more thing, Inari Salak's voice said, as if she were concluding a perfectly ordinary meeting. We've seen bigger. The channel closed. Esirith, who reads patterns, sat very still for a long moment, her membranes flat, her secondary breathing slits barely moving. Then she opened her specimen notes again and added a single line beneath her first entry. They are not afraid of us. I do not yet know why. Esirith had catalogued 47 species responses to the eternal pattern. None had laughed. She was certain of this because she had reviewed every recording in the Empire's Xenocultural Archive before this mission, annotating each species' initial response on a spectrum that ran from immediate capitulation through graduated forms of resistance to what the archive clinically termed doomed defiance. The spectrum was long and had many gradations. Laughter did not appear on it. The human broadcasts in the hours following first contact contained laughter. She had the translation matrix at 63% accuracy now, enough to understand that human electromagnetic communication was not centralized, not commanded, not coordinated by any single authority. The signals came from millions of independent sources simultaneously, which meant that what she was observing was not a managed response but an aggregate one. The sum of millions of individual humans encountering the same information. 4,000 warships had materialized above their world and announced conquest, and producing, in aggregate, responses that included laughter. Also argument. Also what she was learning to identify as humor. Also something that translated poorly, but seemed to involve humans making small, exaggerated imitations of imagined Kethrin communication for the amusement of other humans. They were mocking the Armada. They were doing it publicly, in millions of parallel conversations, without any apparent awareness that this was a remarkable thing to do. Esirith added 17 new entries to her specimen notes before Vale Soreth broadcast the king's ultimatum. The ultimatum was standard: surrender your governing authority to the Eternal Throne within 6 time units or face orbital bombardment. It had been delivered 47 times. It had worked 47 times, though worked, covered a range of responses from immediate compliance through brief symbolic resistance followed by compliance. What it had never produced was what happened next. The diplomatic channel activated again. Inari Salak's voice, same register, same purposeful calm. We've received your ultimatum. We're treating it as a formal diplomatic communication and will respond through formal diplomatic channels. To that end, we're requesting an audience with King Velsora the Undying at his earliest convenience. We'd also like to bring some materials for him to review. As Sirith stopped writing, Vale Sareth's chromatophores went through 3 rapid cycles. "They're requesting an audience," he said, to no one in particular. "I heard," Sirith said. "The ultimatum has been delivered." "I know. They should be composing surrender terms, or beginning evacuation of their leadership. Or, Commander," Sirith pulled up the latest data from the sensor arrays. "Look at this." The orbital platforms were still repositioning, but now she could see what they were doing in detail: rotating, pausing, recording. Every ship in the Armada had been systematically imaged from multiple angles in the past 6 hours. The humans had conducted a comprehensive survey of the entire fleet. "They're mapping us," Vale Sareth said. "Thoroughly," Sirith agreed. "Hull configurations, thruster emission signatures, formation geometry. They've been doing it since before the ultimatum was broadcast." She paused, running the timeline again. "They started mapping us approximately 40 minutes after visual contact, before we identified ourselves, before any communication." Vale Sareth's color display went flat, the Kethran equivalent of very careful thought. Why would they do that? Sirith considered her answer. "I think," she said slowly, "that they wanted to know what they were dealing with before we told them what we were. They didn't trust our self-description. They went and looked for themselves." The channel opened again. A different human voice, male, brusquer, with frequency markers that her matrix was learning to associate with urgency. The matrix identified him as one of several advisors to Inari Salak. "Ambassador Salak is preparing for departure to your flagship. She'll be traveling in a research vessel, single occupant. She's bringing a data drive. She wants to be clear that this is a good faith meeting and she's coming alone." A pause. "She also wants to be clear that if anything happens to her, the response will not be what you're expecting." Vale Sareth looked at Sirith. Sirith was already writing. "They are stalling," she noted, "but the stalling has direction. They are buying time with purpose. The question I cannot yet answer is, time enough for what?" She flagged the entry as urgent and sent it to Vale Sareth's console. He read it. His color display cycled once slowly. Then he opened the channel and granted the audience. Sirith spent the transit time reviewing what she knew about human biology. They were persistence predators. They processed oxygen. They had an unusual pain tolerance for their developmental stage. They formed attachments to other humans, to non-human animals, apparently to inanimate objects, with a speed and depth that no other species in the archive had demonstrated. She kept returning to one data point. In the hours since the Armada appeared, not one of the millions of human broadcast signals she had sampled had advocated surrender. Complaint, yes. Fear, yes. She was learning to read it in the tonal signatures even through the translation gap. Anger, dark, compressed humor, but not surrender. 47 species. Every one of them had produced significant surrender advocacy within the first 2 hours. She filed a new observation. She labeled it, "This species does not consider surrender an option. I do not know if this is courage or a cognitive gap. I am not certain the distinction matters." The audience chamber of the Eternal Throne smelled of rendered iron and the secretions of 1,000 conquered species tribute glands. And Inari Salak walked in like she was late for a lecture. Sirith was positioned in the observation alcove above the main floor, a space traditionally used by Kethran analysts studying conquered species' behavioral responses to proximity with the king. She had a clear view of the full chamber, the 40 war counselors arranged by rank along the walls, the tribute displays of 17 subjugated civilizations, the throne itself, which was not a chair but a living structure of compressed soldiers arranged in symbolic hierarchy, the king at their apex. Inari Salak was a small organism. Sirith had reviewed human-sized data and understood intellectually that the species ran in a fairly narrow range, but something about seeing this individual in the context of the audience chamber recalibrated her understanding. Not the height, the posture. Inari Salak walked through the chamber the way Esirith imagined an apex predator walked into unfamiliar territory, measuring everything, touching nothing, filing it all away. She carried a data drive in her left hand. She had been cleared through 3 security scans. Esirith had read the scan results. The drive contained data, only data. King Velsara, the Undying, looked down from the throne, the soldiers who comprised it shifting slightly to improve his sight line, and spoke in the standard Kethran formal register, which the translation system broadcast to Inari through the earpiece she wore. You come before the eternal throne without tribute and without supplication. Explain this. Inari Salak looked up at him. I brought something better, she said. May I approach the display array? There was a pause. The war counselor's chromatophores cycled in synchronized agitation. Esirith noted that Inari did not look at the war counselors. She kept her attention on the king. The king gestured. Inari walked to the display array, a crystalline surface capable of rendering any format the Kethran archive contained, and inserted her data drive. She had clearly done her research. The drive was formatted to Kethran specifications. This is your fleet, she said. The display rendered. The Eternal Armada appeared in full holographic detail, every ship accurately represented. We've been watching you for 6 days, Inari continued. Not just since you arrived, since you entered our system's outer boundary. Our long-range instruments picked up your fold space transit signature at approximately this coordinate. She highlighted a point on the star map, 63 hours before you achieved visual range. We've had 63 hours of observation data. She advanced the display. The holographic armada disaggregated into component groups, each highlighted in different colors. These 412 ships in your third formation ring have a gravitational resonance signature consistent with hull alloys that perform suboptimally in high magnetic field density environments. Earth has an unusually strong magnetosphere for a planet of its size. At sustained close orbit, these hulls will experience microfracturing along the seam lines. She highlighted the relevant ships. Not catastrophic, but cumulative. The war counselors were very still. Esirith was very still. She was watching the king's face and cataloging everything she saw there. These 708 ships, Inari continued, advancing the display again, use a fuel processing system we've identified by its emission signature. We've cross-referenced it with Kethran technology patents that became available on the galactic open market approximately 40 years ago. We know how it works. She paused. The pause had weight. Esirith recognized the technique. Humans used silence the way Kethran used color, as active communication. 6 days ago, when your fleet arrived, we released a bacterial culture into your fuel processing systems. Bacterial, in the sense that it's biological, engineered, obviously, not naturally occurring. It's inert right now. It's been sitting in your fuel lines for 6 days, doing nothing, waiting. The war counselors erupted. Esirith watched the chamber destabilize. 40 experienced soldiers whose chromatophores all went to the dark red of combat readiness simultaneously. A dozen of them stepping forward, weapons systems activating. The sound was a low harmonic roar that she felt in her secondary membranes. Inari Salak did not move. She stood with her data drive in her hand and watched the war counselors with the same attention she had given the display array, cataloging, measuring, not flinching. The king raised one limb. The chamber went still. This is a fabrication, Velsora said, a threat with no substance. Your engineering teams can check the fuel lines, Inari said. I'd recommend pulling samples from the processing junctions in the 3rd and 5th formation rings. Those systems are highest density and the culture will be most concentrated there. You'll find it. It won't do anything while you're looking at it. It's designed to respond to a specific activation signal, not to ambient conditions. Another pause. We built it in 6 days, she said. We built it while your fleet was in our orbital space, broadcasting ultimatums, while 3 of our cities were being evacuated as a precaution, while our governments were trying to decide whether to declare martial law. We did it at the same time as all of that, not instead of it. She looked up at the king directly. In Kethran culture, direct eye contact from a conquered species was a submission gesture. Esirith was not certain Inari knew this. She was increasingly certain it did not matter. That's what we do when we're scared and running out of time. We build things. The war counselors looked to the king. The king's color display was cycling in a pattern Esirith had never seen before, not in any of the 47 recordings, not in any of the Xenocultural Archive's 17,000 hours of Kethran monarch footage. She did not have a category for it. Velsara the Undying looked at the small human organism standing in the center of his audience chamber, holding a data drive, having just told 4,000 warships what lived in their fuel lines. "What," he said, "do you want?" And Esirith, in her observation alcove above the floor, wrote a single line in her notes. She was right. They were never afraid of us. They were working. The king's third son did not believe in bacterial cultures engineered in 6 days. His name was Veth Carroll, and he commanded 40 ships of his own, his inheritance, his proof of worth, his argument against the other sons in the hierarchy of succession. He was 17 standard cycles old and had never lost a battle, which was not remarkable given that he had only ever fought species that had already been broken by the time his ships arrived, but which felt to him like evidence. He did not believe in the bacterial culture because Velsara the Undying had ordered the fleet to ordered it, to Veth Carroll's understanding, because a single human organism had walked into the audience chamber and said alarming things. This was not, in Veth Carroll's assessment, how an eternal empire behaved. He broke formation at the 6-hour mark of the hold order. Esirith felt it before the instruments confirmed it, the same wrongness she had felt when the fleet arrived, but smaller, localized, 40 ships peeling away from the pattern with the particular resonance of drives pushed past station-keeping thrust. She was at her station, reviewing the audience chamber recordings when the alert came through. Veth Carroll's ships went to bombardment approach on the southern continent. He had picked a landmass with 4 population centers of significant density. He had picked it, Esirith understood, because it was visible from the king's flagship observation deck. A demonstration, proof that the hold order was weakness and that strength looked like this. The first impacts registered on her instruments as pressure waves. She switched to the human broadcast frequencies. She had them on continuous monitoring now, and listened to the aggregate response of millions of humans encountering the fact of bombardment. She had expected the fear signatures to spike. They did. She had expected the argument patterns to shift toward panic. They did briefly. What she had not expected was how quickly the spike collapsed. Not into silence, into something else, something focused and very cold. On the flagship observation deck, she could see Earth's surface, fires in the southern continent, dust rising in columns that the planet's weather systems would carry north within days. She could see 4 Kethran military channels lighting up with communications from Veth Carroll's ships, confirmation of impact targeting data for the second wave. Then Inari Salek's voice came through the diplomatic channel. She had been in the holding suite aboard the flagship during the hold period, presumably waiting for the negotiation to continue. Esirith had checked on her twice via the suite's environmental monitors, watching her eat and sleep and work on what appeared to be the same data drive she had brought to the audience chamber. "I need you to pass a message to Prince Veth Carroll," Inari said. Her voice was the same register it had always been. Esirith ran a tonal analysis automatically, looking for elevated stress markers. She found them elevated cortisol analogs, respiratory rate up, something in the frequency range that she had learned to associate with suppressed anger. But the register was the same, controlled. "Tell him we're activating the culture in his ships only." Please make sure he understands his ships only. We're not doing this to your whole fleet. We're showing him specifically what we built." Esirith transmitted the message. She watched the instruments. She watched 40 Kethrin warships, Veth Carol's 40, specifically the ones that had broken formation, the ones that had fired go dark. Not destroyed, dark. Power failing, drive systems going offline in cascade sequences, weapons arrays dropping to zero. 40 ships of the Eternal Armada drifting in orbit above a burning continent, inert, helpless, their crews alive and unharmed inside hulls that had simply stopped working. The third formation ring's remaining ships held their positions. The fifth ring held. The whole armada held 3,960 warships, watching 40 of their own become debris without a single weapon fired from the planet below. Esirith was monitoring the collective signal net, the chemical electromagnetic hybrid communication system that ran through the fleet like a nervous system. She had been monitoring it since first contact, watching its baseline rhythms, learning its emotional registers. She felt the change before she could name it. It was new. It did not match any pattern in her archive of Kethrin fleet communications. She ran it through every category she had: aggression, territorial warning, grief, battle readiness, awe, and found no fit. Then she understood with a researcher's cold certainty that she was feeling it too, and that the name for it was simpler than she had been making it. Fear. Not of the humans' weapons, not of the culture in the fuel lines, though that was present in the signal. The fear was of something less tangible and therefore more difficult to defend against. It was the fear of a predator that has cornered prey and looked into its eyes and understood, too late, that it has made a categorical error. The king summoned Inari, Salak, back to the audience chamber. Esirith was already at her station. She watched the human walk through the corridor, the same walk, the same posture, but something in the way she held her head had changed. Not harder, heavier. Esirith ran the environmental monitors for the holding suite and looked at the records from the hours of the bombardment. Inari had been at her console when the first impacts registered. She had watched the feeds. She had watched the fires. And then she had opened a channel and given the activation code. Esirith understood. The woman had not wanted to use it. The same instrument she had built as a demonstration had become a weapon the moment Veth Carol fired, and she had used it with precision, the minimum necessary, the surgical answer. But she had used it while watching her own cities burn, and the weight of that was in her face when she walked back into the audience chamber. The king looked at her. Esirith watched his color display and could not read it. Inari set her data drive on the edge of the display array. 40 ships, she said. Her voice was steady. There are 3,960 left. Do you want to find out if we were busy the whole week? The chamber was silent. The answer, Esirith understood, did not matter. The question was the thing. The question contained everything the king needed to know about what kind of species had built a weapon in 6 days while their cities were being evacuated and their governments were arguing about martial law. They had been busy the whole week. Every Kethrin in the room knew it. The mathematics of that knowledge, what a species like this became if you gave it not 6 days but 6 months, 6 years, a generation, the geological time that the Eternal Empire operated on, ran through the audience chamber like a current through standing water. Velsora the Undying looked at the small human with the data drive and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "We will negotiate terms." The Eternal Throne had never been silent. In 6,000 years of Kethrin expansion, no species had ever made it so. Esirith filed her preliminary report in the hours after the negotiation concluded, sitting in her observation alcove above a chamber that had emptied slowly, reluctantly, war counselors departing in ones and twos with their color displays cycling through patterns she was still cataloging. The silence was not literal. The flagship had its own sounds, its own mechanical rhythms. the biological hum of 4,000 ships maintaining position. But the silence she meant was the kind that lived in the signal net, in the space between what the Kethrans said to each other and what they were actually thinking. Nobody knew what to call this. That was the silence. The withdrawal took 11 hours to negotiate. Esirith sat through all of it, watching Inari Salak work. The terms were precise. The 40 disabled ships would remain in their orbits, crews unharmed, life support intact, not as prizes but as collateral, as Inari had specified, evidence of good faith running in both directions. They were to be returned when the non-aggression framework had been ratified by whatever Kethran process the king considered binding. Inari had asked, carefully and specifically, which process that was. She had written down the answer, and had someone on Earth verify it against the Galactic Legal Archive before she signed anything. She had also negotiated, in what felt to Esirith like an afterthought but almost certainly was not, her own appointment as primary human liaison to the Kethran Empire, with a designated counterpart. She had specified that the counterpart should be someone who had been present throughout the events of the past week. The king had looked at Esirith. Esirith had looked back at him. She had not known whether she was being exiled or promoted or something the Kethran hierarchy did not have a word for yet. She was assigned to Earth. She arrived in the second month, on a shuttle that the humans guided in with the same methodical efficiency they brought to everything, and she was met by Inari Salak at the landing platform. It was raining. Humans, she had learned from the archive, had weather. She had known this intellectually. She had not understood, until the rain touched her sensory membranes, what it meant to live on a planet where the atmosphere moved. "We thought you'd want to start in the southern continent," Inari said. "The cities that were hit." Esirith had expected, she realized, to be shown something terrible. A demonstration of grievance, an argument for the moral weight of the negotiation. She had prepared observations about guilt management across species lines. What she found was construction. The streets of the first city were full of people doing things. Not milling, not grieving publicly, not performing in the way she had seen species perform grief for political effect. Though she understood the grief was present, she could read it in the cortisol signatures she'd been given access to, in the set of faces, in the particular careful movements of people working near damage. They were rebuilding with the same organizational intensity she had watched them use to engineer the bacterial culture, which had initially struck her as a kind of violence, but which she now recognized as something more fundamental. It was how they processed the fact of their own vulnerability. They built. She spent 3 months in the southern continent. She filed reports every week. The king read them, or someone read them and summarized them for him. She had stopped assuming she understood information hierarchies. Her final report was the one she had been drafting since the audience chamber, since the moment she had watched Inari Salak stand still while war counselors surrounded her and not flinch. "They were afraid," she wrote. "I want to be precise about this. I have reviewed the cortisol records, the private communications, the broadcast patterns, not the public signals but the private ones, the ones between individuals who did not expect to be heard. They were terrified. From the moment the fleet appeared in their sky to the moment the withdrawal began, the fear was continuous and documented and genuine." She paused. "They built the weapon anyway. They negotiated the terms anyway. Ambassador Salak walked into the audience chamber anyway. I have reviewed every case in the Xenocultural Archive, 47 species, 6,000 years of records, and I have not found another species that operated this way at scale. Individual organisms in extremis have demonstrated this pattern. Isolated cases. But as a species-level behavior, consistent, repeated, apparently normative." She stopped again, because she was approaching the edge of her categorical framework and she did not want to overstate. She wrote, "They do not fight because they are not afraid. They fight because they are afraid, and they have decided the fear is not the most important thing. She filed the report and went outside. She was in a residential neighborhood near the edge of one of the rebuilt districts. The pavement was new in places, lighter colored than the older surfaces, not yet weathered. Children were doing something with sticks of chalk, which she had learned were a pigment delivery system for temporary marking. She had seen humans make marks on surfaces before. The archive was full of it, thousands of years of it, one of the species' most continuous behaviors. They marked things. They made the world legible to themselves and each other. She stopped. A child had drawn the fleet. She recognized it from the orbital surveys she had spent weeks analyzing. The formation geometry was roughly right, the scale entirely wrong, but the intent was clear. 4,000 small shapes arranged in the eternal pattern, crowded together on 3 square meters of pavement. 40 of them were colored differently. Set apart in the upper corner, done in a different chalk, the lines a little more deliberate. A child who had been given the shapes of those 40 ships specifically, or who had seen enough footage to know that those 40 were distinct. Esirith stood very still, her membranes flat, watching the child work. "What are those ones called?" the child asked, without looking up. She had apparently known, with whatever peripheral attention children possessed, that Esirith was there. Esirith told her. The 40 ships designation in Kethrin, a technical string that meant something approximately like the third son's inheritance, in the hierarchy-inflected language of the Empire. The child nodded very seriously and went back to the chalk. She added something Esirith had not seen in the drawing before, a single figure, small, standing in front of the entire fleet, in front of all 4,000 ships. The figure was maybe 4 centimeters tall. The fleet took up the rest of the pavement. Esirith looked at the chalk figure. She looked at the 4,000 ships behind it. She did not correct the scale. The rain had stopped. Somewhere in the rebuilt district, someone was hammering something into place. A regular sound, patient and continuous. The sound of a species that treated the gap between what existed and what they wanted to exist as a problem to be solved, rather than a fact to be endured. Esirith stood on the new pavement in the city that had been burning 3 months ago, and listened to the hammering and understood, in the particular way that understanding arrived, not as a revelation, but as an accumulation finally reaching its threshold, that she had been wrong about what the Kethrin had encountered here. They had not encountered a species that was not afraid. They had encountered a species that was afraid and built things anyway, that bled and engineered anyway, that watched their cities burn and gave the activation code, and then got up in the morning and started hammering. The galaxy had never seen the Eternal Armada withdraw. The galaxy would hear about this, and when they heard, they would ask why. She already knew the answer. She had watched it being drawn in chalk on new pavement. Because one of them had stood in front of all 4,000 ships and asked a question. And because they had all been building the answer before anyone thought to ask.